Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. In 2020, I kicked off a new season of Talking Aussie Books with a fabulous Australian author that I am delighted to have the opportunity to chat to again today. Kelly Rimmer is a New York Times, Wall Street Journal and USA Today best-selling author of 10 novels. Her titles include Before I Let You Go, The Things We Cannot Say, and Truths I Never Told You. Her brand new novel, The Warsaw Orphan, was released by Hachette Australia at the end of April this year. And what an incredible story of courage, resilience and survival it is. Meticulously researched and utterly compelling, this has to be one of Kelly's best novels to date. I am thrilled to welcome Kelly back to the podcast today. Hi, Kelly.
Hello, thank you so much for talking with me again.
Well, haven't you been a super busy lady since our impromptu dinner in Cronulla back in February of last year?
That was such a fun night, and little did we know it was going to have to sustain us for a very long time.
Indeed, it was a beautiful night, and it was right on the cusp of, everything falling to pieces in the world. So, yeah, it was a bit of a last hurrah on our part, wasn't it?
It was, even if we didn't know it at the time. That was such a great crew. Pam Cook was there, and Anna Loda was there. Oh, we had such a great chat, and the food was amazing. That's a good memory. Good memory of 2020.
Indeed, if there is one to be taken from 2020, it's a good one. Absolutely, I'll take that. I'm just telling you before we started recording that I really and truly loved this novel. It was an amazing insight into something I knew very little about. So I wanted to ask you, what inspired you to write this novel?
As you know, Claudine, I had a novel set in Poland, an earlier novel, The Things We Cannot Say. And during the course of kind of researching that, I had travelled to Poland with my aunt, and she really, really likes to walk. And it was the height of summer, and the days are very, very long in Poland, in Warsaw at the height of summer. And she was waking up with the sun at like 3 a.m. and she would kind of immediately want to go for a walk through the city. And it was beautiful because, walking through such a gorgeous city when the streets are kind of asleep, but it's daylight, it was just like remarkable. And some days we did many, many, many kilometers. One day I think we did 32 kilometers. Oh my goodness. And she got cross with me because I had told people her age. But it's fair to say I'm 41 and she's a few decades older than me. Wow. And she definitely could outwalk me. And the walking is relevant because while we were there, so we're going for these really long morning walks and then we're researching and we're going to different places during the day and she wanted to walk everywhere. And we covered so much of the city on foot and I saw all of these really fascinating monuments and different landmarks that I would never have seen had I been there on my own, purely because I'm quite terrified of her. She's wonderful, but she's very strong-willed. So I was just, happy to kind of walk when she wanted to walk. And in hindsight, this novel really came out of all of those adventures that we had. There were times when we would walk a long way, go to a museum, and I would walk at the museum. You'd be seeing things about different, landmarks that we had walked past on the way there. And Warsaw kind of came to life in my mind in a way that was really interesting, especially since the book that I was writing at the time wasn't set in Warsaw. But in the back of my mind, I kind of became a little bit fixated on these two real-life Polish historical figures. There was Irena Sendler, who was this she was a Polish nurse and social worker who worked for the Warsaw Department of Health and Sanitation, and she used real credentials, to go into the Warsaw Ghetto under the kind of the guise of checking for typhus. But really what she was doing was conducting this amazing resistance operation where she was inoculating people against typhus and rescuing Jewish children. And she ended up coordinating this team of about 24 people, mostly women. And collectively they saved and then sustained the lives of 2,500 Jewish children who otherwise probably would have perished when the ghetto was liquidated. so she was such a remarkable woman, and I was so shocked that I'd never heard of her. And I was really kind of embarrassed about how little I understood about the Warsaw Ghetto itself and all the things that had happened in Warsaw over the course of the war. And I also discovered this Polish historian, Emanuel Ringelblum, who had, with a group of people, started collecting documents to kind of prove how horrific the conditions in the ghetto really had been. And he and his team collected, I think it's 25,000 pages of evidence of what happened within the Warsaw Ghetto. Unfortunately, they ultimately buried those documents beneath the city, and a third of the archive was lost. But even in the 2/3 that historians recovered after the war, he has given us this amazing insight into what life was like for those people. And none of that fit within the book I was there to write. I really wanted to fit particularly Irena's story within the book that I was writing, The Things We Cannot Say. And there's a minor character in that book, Amelia, and I had thought Amelia might become involved with Irena and her team. But, The Things We Cannot Say is already quite a full story, and I could not fit it in, and so I kind of cut that out, and Amelia's a child throughout that story. And then I just forgot about it. I kind of, I thought, I'd really like to write that one day, and just kind of put it in the back of my mind. And it was only that a book club in 2018, someone said to me, can't you just write Amelia's story? Like, we'd really love a sequel. Couldn't you write that? And I thought, actually, yes, I could. And I've kind of plotted it already. I just couldn't fit it in the book. So here we are. Here we are. And I used a lot of Emanuel Ringelblum's resources in this section of the book that's set in the ghetto. Wherever I could, I referred back to that archive.
To be clear, The Warsaw Orphan is a standalone novel, but it draws on some of the events that occurred in your previous book.
That's right. So, yeah, you could definitely read either book without the other. But if you've read The Things We Cannot Say, you will recognise characters in the new book. It's set, The Things We Cannot Say has a contemporary and a historical timeline, and the character of Amelia appears in both. And really, this book would squish in the middle period, the first part of the middle period between those two timelines, but they are standalone, both of them.
So, for those who haven't read it yet, Kelly, I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about the story.
We pick up in 1942, and Amelia is living with her adoptive family in an apartment building between the Vistula River and the Warsaw Ghetto, but she's living this quite sheltered life. She's potentially on the run. So her brother has been executed for aiding Jews in hiding, which is punishable by death. And not just to him, but to his immediate family. And so Amelia's adoptive parents are quite concerned that she may be in danger. So she's living as Elżbieta Rabinek rather than her real name, Amelia. And she's 13, nearly 14, or, she's at that stage of life where where it really counts if you're close to the next numerical milestone, and she's really trapped for her own safety. She's trapped in this apartment with her uncle and her adoptive parents, and they recognize that she's getting older and she needs some kind of freedom. They allow her to visit the courtyard of the apartment building just for a little brief window every afternoon, but she starts to rebel, and she doesn't want to cause trouble, but everything's out of control. And so she claws back just a tiny bit of control by, instead of going to the courtyard, she visits a neighbour. And the neighbour is Sarah, who is a nurse and social worker. And Sarah talks to Amelia about her, about all the things that 13-year-old girls need to know about life and anatomy and her body, and teaches her craft, and they read books, and they have this lovely relationship. But through Sarah, Amelia kind of inadvertently discovers that Sarah is involved in a program to rescue children from the ghetto. And being quite headstrong and someone who really has a strong sense of justice, Amelia kind of waggles her way into helping Sarah and the program with the rescue of children. And through that work, she meets a young Jewish boy, Roman Gorka. And Roman and his family are imprisoned in the ghetto. He has a newborn baby sister, Eleonora, and a little baby brother, Dawidek, and beloved mother and stepfather. And they are in absolutely impossible circumstances. But through Amelia's work with Sarah, she gets to know Roman, and the story kind of follows them through the ghetto, the years of the ghetto, or the period of the ghetto where the ghetto existed, and then the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which was one of these events that I had kind of vaguely been aware of before I started researching this book. But I was kind of deeply embarrassed once I started researching it, how little I knew about it, because it's one of the bravest, most incredible acts of resistance, surely in modern human history. This group of scrappy young Jewish men and women with virtually no resources managed to hold off the might of the German army for 28 days. And, in prison, they basically were all half starved and they'd lost so much and they just wanted to assert some dignity, and they absolutely did that. And so it kind of follows Amelia and Roman through that period, and then later on through the Warsaw Uprising, which is when the whole city of Warsaw came together to resist the occupation, and later still through the early years of the communist regime.
Now, you mentioned both Amelia and Roman, and the story is told from both of their points of view. And they live on different sides of the ghetto wall, as you mentioned, until Amelia rebels. But before she, undertakes work with Sarah, she has no idea of what life is like for her Jewish compatriots, does she?
No, and that in her circumstance, she is incredibly sheltered. But for many people in the city of Warsaw, even those who lived nearby, they were aware that it was worse. Their own lives were difficult enough with the occupation, but they were aware that what was happening on the other side of the wall was worse. But it's so complex. Some people were outraged, and some people, there was a lot of anti-Semitism even from the Poles in the city. But it was so difficult for people to really understand the depth of what was happening inside. And the Nazis were masters of propaganda. And so Amelia's ignorance of how difficult things are for those Jewish people is kind of representative of some, big chunks of the city, because people just did not know.
Now, you wrote the scenes in the ghetto with such vivid detail, those scenes in which Roman, his brother, and others scrounged or begged for food, hid themselves from the Germans. Now, you mentioned some research that you did to bring these experiences to the page. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, for sure. So I had planned on going back to Poland to research this book, and I was kind of gearing up to go before Christmas in 2019, and then I was invited to do some events in the US and Canada, so I pushed it back a little bit and got back to Australia kind of the second week of February 2020. And obviously my plans for further international travel suddenly came to a screaming halt. But we are so lucky to live in the time we live in. I was able to, I wanted to refer to that Ringelblum archive, or to use it as a reference wherever I could, because the whole point of that collection of documents and the danger that those people put themselves in was to make sure that people could read and know what they and their families had endured. And so wherever I could, I referred back to bits and pieces from that archive, either photographs or, there were lots of propaganda posters and journal entries. I really love, when I'm researching, there's kind of three ways that I like to research. I love looking at photographs. I find that from a photograph, you can pick up on the emotion in people's eyes, and you can pick up on the style of dress. And even in some of the photos from the Warsaw Ghetto, you see people smiling at the camera, but you can see that they don't want to be smiling, because often it would be a German soldier taking the photo. And in the background, you see the buildings are quite dense, but the population is incredibly, terrifyingly dense. There was 30% of the population of the city of Warsaw in an area of something like 2.3% of the city. There were up to maybe 450,000 people crammed into just a few kilometres squared. And so when you look at these photos, you can learn so much about what people actually endured. I really, really like to listen to oral histories, and that there's, again, luckily there are plenty of resources that we can access now where people are or have actively, and museums in particular, actively recorded the oral history of people who lived through these times. And the third thing I like to do, which isn't really possible with this kind of historical fiction, is interviews. In this case, where I could, I was using references from the Ringelblum archive and oral histories from various museums around the world that you can generally access digitally.
Kelly, I was fascinated by the thread in this book about record keeping of placements of the orphan children with new families, and the jar that was buried by the apple tree. I was wondering if you could tell me how that thread of the story came about.
Yes, absolutely. So this is taken directly from Irena Sendler's real life story. So she, these 2,500 children, her and her team had rescued, and she kept meticulous records on cigarette paper. So she would record who the biological family of the child was, where the child was taken and what their new identity was, because they would smuggle the children out either in coffins or through tunnels or in suitcases for newborns or medical bags, or they had all of these crafty and incredible ways of getting these little people from one side of the war to the other. But that was only the beginning of the journey, because then the children would have to be often taught Catholic prayers, so that if they were stopped by a German soldier, the German soldier would often interrogate them, particularly if their features looked typically Semitic, and for like young boys, they would often be disguised as female children, so that they wouldn't, obviously most Jewish boys are circumcised, and the Germans certainly did not think twice about checking that, even on children, if they had suspicions. And so there was this whole process of giving these children a whole new identity, and sometimes it was quite elaborate, the way that they went, the lengths that they went to hide the children. But Irena kept these records, and she kept them in her apartment throughout most of this. She was so courageous. I really cannot stress enough. This woman, this young woman, saw this immense tragedy unfolding before her eyes and had been raised in a family that valued other people's welfare so highly. Her father had said to her, father was a doctor, and he had always said to her, if you see someone drowning, you save them. That was kind of the creed by which she lived. So every day, for years, she would go into the ghetto, risking her life on any number of levels, smuggling supplies in, smuggling children out, and then within her very apartment, keeping this jar of names. And at one point, the Gestapo did come into her home to interrogate her, and she threw it out the window. And her colleague downstairs caught it, and then they hid it. They literally hid it under an apple tree. And through that jar was eventually recovered and handed over to Jewish authorities. And some children were recovered back to their families. Obviously, most of the families within the ghetto, the parents would have perished, which in itself, to say it like that, the tragedy that is encompassed in that one sentence is beyond what we should be able to bear. But Irena, she valued the families and the lives of those people in a way that way above her own. Do you know what I mean? She just was so selfless and brave. And when I first encountered her, I was kind of angry that I hadn't heard of her before. But we've heard of other heroes from the war, but often men. And Irena did so much, and her team of mostly women. And when I was researching, I kept thinking, who are these women that she was working with? But they're kind of recorded in history as her team of mostly women. Their names are kind of lost to time for the most part. That was the process. Quite just absolutely amazing.
It is incredible to read about that. But I mean, this is just another example of women's histories, having been hidden for so long.
Yes. Well, even Irena, we would not know about her. I certainly would not have encountered her. But for a group of children in Kansas, teenage girls in Kansas in the 90s, who were given a history assignment at school to use primary sources to do a history assignment, and they found a record, just a casual reference to Irena in some record, and they were thinking, who is this woman? And they dug deeper and deeper and ultimately connected with Irena and her family directly. And then they wrote a play about her called Life in a Jar, and eventually got to go to Poland to meet her. And through those kids, which I just think is the most beautiful symmetry. If you were writing a fictional story, it couldn't be any more perfect. That it was children who unearthed her story in the end. And as a result of that, Irena was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and she's been recognized as righteous among the nations. But without those children, Irena was so humble that she didn't see what she'd done as extraordinary. She just thought, I was just doing what anyone would do. But of course, it wasn't what anyone would do. It was really, really special.
Nelia's experiences were horrific, as were Roman's. It almost felt as if it would be impossible for Polish people to rebuild their lives after the war, but they did. Does it ever make you marvel at the tenacity of the human spirit?
Oh, absolutely. And the city of Warsaw was 85 to 90% destroyed by the end of the uprising and completely evacuated. And yet, to visit there today, it is this vibrant, alive, thriving kind of a beautiful city that has been rebuilt, and the culture has been rebuilt. I mean, the Nazis went to great lengths to destroy cultural landmarks like libraries and museums and monuments, and yet the city of Warsaw is it's got one of the most remarkable museums in the world, in the Museum of Polish Jewish History. And there are monuments, and they've rebuilt the old town. So it really, I wanted to write the book in such a way that readers would get a sense of how relentless the latter years of the war were for the citizens of Warsaw. It was one thing after another. There was no break. It just was horrendous and chaotic, and people were displaced, and people were dying, and people were starving, and it was just one thing after another. But the city very quickly began to rebuild, even though, really, for the rest of the world, the war kind of ended in 1945, but Poland was occupied by the communists until the late 80s. And so in some ways, the war didn't really end for them for years, for decades, and yet still they rebuilt the country. It's just such a story of the resilience of the human spirit and the goodness of the human spirit. So this book covers a lot of really awful things, but I hope that there's a light there. There's hope. There's people's love between families and friends and a city. It's a story of survival, not just a story of tragedy.
In this day and age, it seems that readers are never more fascinated by historical fiction. And why do you think that is?
I think particularly for fiction that kind of stars women, we are making up for a bit of lost time. Women have been excluded from the publishing industry since there was a publishing industry. And now it's kind of our time. And so I think particularly we're reconsidering history. It's stories like Irena's that too few of us know about. And so I think that fascination with especially modern history comes back to, we know we have always been taught and we have thought about history as something that men starred in, but that's actually not true. And so I think that's part of it. And I think another part of it is that we're in such turbulent times, particularly the world last year and in certain parts of the world this year. It feels really out of control, and you wonder what's next, what's next. But these kinds of stories remind us that the human race has been through even worse than the worst, and we recover, we learn, and we recover, and we must learn. Even now, it really concerns me that here we are, 80 odd years after the war, and there are great big chunks of our young people who don't understand just how bad it was, how it happened, and people turn their backs. And if we don't learn from that, then of course it can happen again. So I think it's a big combination of all of those factors.
Really, I have a few scenes in this book that I don't think I'll ever really forget. Scenes that, as a mother, made me wonder if I would have made the same choices. Impossible scenarios that the cruelty of war puts people in. Do you find it difficult to write these scenes?
I've always been drawn to these really emotionally complex subjects right from the start of my writing. But this book, probably for the first time, I really struggled at times to look at the research and to put myself in the shoes of a mother or a brother or a sister, or, those scenarios around family are very, very difficult to confront. But we have to. I just kept thinking about, there was this resistance fighter in the Warsaw Ghetto who said something like, the fighters couldn't walk away and couldn't look away, and we can't look away. If we do, then their stories are kind of lost. And I just kept thinking about that, as I'd think, I can't do this today. Particularly I was writing the final draft during that brief period of lockdown that we had in Australia, and at the time, we didn't know what was going to happen next. It really was very uncertain, and I was quite worried for my family and my parents and, the country, the world. And I kept thinking, I wish I was writing something easier in this time when life was emotionally taxing on its own. But if we look away, it really, really, when I'm writing historical fiction, I always think if you look away or if you soften it, then you run the risk of people thinking, oh, that wasn't so bad, and if you try, you have to try and represent it accurately, and you can't shy away from the ugly parts of it, because this happened to people. And there were times when I was tempted briefly, and even at one point encouraged by someone to maybe soften different parts. Some of those scenes are so fraught, and most people struggle to write difficult things around children because we are, from our very instincts, wanting to protect children, and we understand that they're this special part of society that deserves a special kind of level of protection. But again, you can't shy away from it. If I was to represent the Warsaw Ghetto as anything other than hell on earth, then people might think, well, that wasn't so bad. But it was as bad as you can imagine. And so you have to be, it's like, obviously, brave is, I've used the word brave to describe Irena Sendler, so I really feel very bad using it to describe writing about Irena Sendler, but you have to confront it. And as readers, I hope people are able to confront it, because that, like I say in the author's note, I think the role of historical fiction is kind of to interest us enough to do our own research in these subjects, and to recognise that this is something that is worthy of our attention and time, and it's important that we learn about it and teach our children about it so that we can stop it from ever happening again.
Do you think that you learn different things about writing with each novel that you write?
Yes, and this is something that really I'm writing at the moment, my 2022 book, which is probably going to be called The German Wife, and it's been a complex one to research, particularly, obviously can't just go on a trip, which would have made it easier. And so this will be, I think it's book number 12. And there's a certain period when I'm researching and writing where I think I don't know how to do it, even after 12 books. Isn't that crazy?
It is. From my point, from where I'm sitting, it is.
Every time, Claudine, I'm stressing myself out going, how do I get this far when I don't actually know how to do this?
Oh.
A little bit of that's imposter syndrome, and a little bit of it is every book presents its own challenges. And even though the process is the same, for me, it's plotting, research, writing, refining ad nauseum. It's the same process every time, but particularly there's a critical mass I need to reach with word count. And I'm a fiend for, I start writing, I'll write a bunch of words, I'll decide, nah, not working, chuck it out, start again. And I get caught in this loop where I forget that my first draft is going to be rubbish. It's meant to be rubbish, Kelly. Like you would think by now I would know this, and yet every time. So in some ways, I'm a very, very, very slow learner.
Oh, no way! I can't accept that.
Honestly, if you could see me pacing my office going, I just don't know how to do this. And then the thing is, once I get going, of course I do know how to do it, and I've done it before, but it's still that the games that your own brain plays with yourself. So I think it's always going to be hard, and it's always kind of meant to be hard. Like I think for writers starting out, or if you're on your first book or your second book or short story or whatever, there are times when even though the inner monologue might be saying, I don't know how to do this. Who even wants to read this? Who do I think I am to tell this story? It's a case of for each of us pressing through that, because really at the end of the day, you could have the same brief as me, Claudine, and we would still produce two completely different stories, because nobody can tell the story like each of us can. And that's the magic of it. So you just have to press through the self-doubt. So my tip at the moment is I don't know what I'm doing either. And we all just have to keep bumbling through, because it's really important that we do.
Well, I'm so glad that you said that, because I'm totally at that point now in a manuscript that I'm working on.
See?
It's just gone through an edit, and I'm thinking, who cares? Who's going to care about this story? Why am I even telling this story? So that's really lovely advice, and thank you very much for telling me that.
And the thing is that it's worth doing just for the sake of the thing. Like, this is what I keep trying to say to my kids about different pieces of art that they might produce, be it a short story, or they're both avid drawers, and my daughter likes to paint. And sometimes it's worth doing just for the process and the effect that art has on you in working through whatever stress you're under or whatever joy you have. It's worth doing just to express it. And the fact that for those of us who are writers get to connect with readers through a story, it's actual magic, and it's always worth doing, no matter how big or small your audience is. So I'm glad we're recording this, because I might need to play that back to myself later today. I'm such a hypocrite.
You can listen to yourself on playback each time you have those doubts. Oh, that is just gold. So, Kelly, you're surrounded by a community of like-minded writing women, and I wanted to ask you, how important is it for you and your writing process to be part of this network?
I was just thinking about this the other day. So I've really only had a network of Australian writers in the last few years. Before that, I was mostly publishing overseas, didn't really know anyone here. And I didn't really have a network of writers that I could bounce story problems by, or when I had conundrums with publishers, I didn't have anyone to go to for advice. And that was quite isolating, and I bumbled through, but just in the last few weeks, I was absolutely stuck on this one subplot. It's a small thing, but the whole second half of my novel for next year hangs on it. And I had plotted out the whole book. I've done all the research. I've written big chunks of it, but this one thing still wasn't coming together. And I spent like hours talking to a friend about it, and she straight away had an idea. And just in one word, she fixed it. Just talking it through with her, and she just said, "What about this?" And I went, "Oh my goodness, that's exactly what I need to do." But I couldn't have done that on my own. And so it was talking it through sometimes helps, and then other times it's like I'm in the forest, forest, and all I can see is one tree, and she can see the whole forest like an editor can. I really, really value that now. I don't know how I would be. I mean, I've been lucky enough to have some great opportunities and experiences, but at different times I really haven't known how to proceed with something, or should I do this, or is this normal? And having that network has been so helpful, both in terms of craft and career. So I really think it's very important that people develop those networks.
Now, last year when we spoke, you mentioned you were working on both a World War II historical and a contemporary romance. So I wanted to know, did that romance eventuate?
I have finished it. I'm actually not writing contemporary romance at the moment because I keep picking these historical concepts that require insane amounts of research. And I'm not sure when that contemporary romance will be published. It's sitting there. It's at some point it will be, but for now, I actually think for the next few years, I really, really like being busy, and I'm probably working the same amount, but I'm just finding that the concepts I'm drawn to in the history space are taking up all of the hours that used to be split between them. So my contemporary romance stream is on hiatus until I come up with some easier books to write in the historical space.
Kelly, if listeners wanted to find out more about you and your books, where could they do that?
I am at kellyrimmer.com, and I'm on Facebook at Kelly M. Rimmer, and Instagram and Twitter at Kel Rimmer Writes. But if you go to my website, the links are all there for all of the other bits and pieces.
Kelly, it was a joy to read this book and to chat to you about it today. Wishing you every success with it, and thank you for taking the time to join me on Talking Aussie Books.
My absolute pleasure, Claudine. Always love talking to you.
Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.